Is Phil Mickelson ever going to be the Ryder Cup captain? We don't know that for sure, and we don't know what the future holds, but we know he's not the man for 2025. And Phil Mickelson said so himself. I'm Ryan Ballantyne with Golf News Net. Thanks for tuning in today. Today we're going to talk about some comments from Phil Mickelson about his future as the Ryder Cup captain on the U.S. side, and specifically how it relates to the next Ryder Cup in 2025 at Bethpage Black in New York. Many years ago, when this was first announced that Bethpage Black was going to host a Ryder Cup, so many people, myself included, figured Phil was a shoo-in for this job. He's been a Ryder Cup stalwart for the United States for the better part of 3 decades and over 20 plus years being a part of this competition. He hasn't had the best record, but he's been a key part of it. And many people expected him to get the job as captain of the U.S. Ryder Cup side whenever this event happened. It was originally scheduled for 2024. Because of the pandemic, it got moved to 2025. And at the time, I think when that move happened, people still figured Mickelson would eventually get this job. But things have changed in the last couple of years. Mickelson's moved on to LIV Golf, and he's upset a lot of people in the process, even though there are other players who moved to LIV Golf and were a little bit more quiet about it, but still caused part of the upheaval that's happening in the game right now. And ultimately, Mickelson has been somewhat of a scapegoat in many ways for what has happened between the PGA Tour and LIV Golf, and that has bled into how he's considered by his peers on the PGA Tour, a select group of them that get to decide who gets to be the next Ryder Cup captain. And in 2025, we don't know who that's going to be on the U.S. side, but Mickelson knows it's not him. So appearing on the Pat McAfee show on ESPN, Mickelson was asked about the subject, and he was pretty clear about it. He said, quote, "I don't feel I'm the right guy to be involved with the team because I'm a very divisive character right now. I understand the players on the PGA Tour. There's a lot of hostilities toward me." End quote. And he's right. I mean, Mickelson knows he is not particularly well liked on the PGA Tour side of things. One of the biggest kind of holdups in the negotiations between the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, and the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which owns LIV, is about how to treat players who went to LIV from the PGA Tour and how to either welcome them back or punish them or something in between. And Mickelson's right at the top of that list. There are a lot of players who hold grudges against Mickelson because he took the money, he went to LIV Golf, he recruited players, he helped precipitate a lot of the things that are happening here. The reality is, though, that there would have been another Mickelson. There could have been another player who would have done very similar things if it were not for Mickelson, even though he is quoted as saying all kinds of different things about this process that have gotten him into kind of hot water with sponsors and players and peers and other folks. But he has been the one that said this is a kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change how the PGA Tour operates. In the end, Phil was right about that. The PGA Tour is changing how it operates. It changed dramatically, and it's still going to change more. But despite being part of the catalyst for that change, and maybe a significant part of it, that doesn't mean he automatically gets the right to come back and be on the same track he was on before all this LIV stuff happened. Ultimately, you have players who are on the Ryder Cup committee who work together to determine who will be the next Ryder Cup captain. And those players clearly have influence over who will be vice captains, who will be future captains. And those guys are Tiger Woods and Davis Love III and Steve Stricker and Jim Furyk and to a degree Stuart Sink and Fred Couples. And a lot of those guys have been pretty darn vocal about how they feel about LIV, which means that's going to bleed into how they feel about players who went to LIV, whether that's a younger player, whether that's a closer to middle-aged player like Dustin Johnson, whether that's a player that's similar in age to them like Phil Mickelson. That's going to change how they think about those players and how they're involved in the Ryder Cup in the future. The big question for me is if there is an agreement and when that happens between the PGA Tour, DP World Tour, the Public Investment Fund, Strategic Sports Group, whoever winds up being involved in this, will the PGA of America get involved and try to encourage a coming back together, at least on the American side, parties that have been in factions for the last couple of years based on the tour that they play? I don't know if that's going to be the case, but the DP World Tour has a huge commercial interest in the Ryder Cup. They own the biggest portion of Ryder Cup Europe. And so if they're bringing that asset to this new company deal, in a way, the PGA Tour has an ownership stake in the Ryder Cup. And that will change dramatically, potentially, how this competition is viewed, how it works, how it's monetized. There could be some significant changes on the horizon, including who ultimately gets the opportunity to captain both sides. We know Henrik Stenson lost the opportunity last time around because he signed with LIV Golf. That went to Luke Donald. Luke Donald wound up being a great captain over in Rome. He almost immediately got the job for Bethpage Black to get the rare opportunity to go back-to-back, home and away in this biennial competition. Whenever this agreement is settled, whenever that looks like, will people like Stenson, Ian Poulter, Lee Westwood on the European side, Sergio Garcia ultimately get the opportunity to captain their side? And on the American side, will players like Phil Mickelson and Dustin Johnson and Brooks Koepka ultimately get that opportunity if they wish to pursue it? I don't know, and I don't think Phil knows either, but I think he has probably resigned himself to the fact that there's an opportunity or a potential situation where he turns into this generation's Larry Nelson. Larry Nelson had a perfect record in a Ryder Cup, won, 3 majors, 3 U.S. Opens, and never got the opportunity to be captain because he got passed over for Lanny Wadkins, and then it never came back to him. This may be happening to Phil now, where he gets passed over in this particular spot where so many people thought he would be the captain and may never get it again. Because once you get into your 50s and certainly into your 60s, it becomes much more difficult to get this job, particularly in a time where both sides are looking to have younger captains who are still in touch with players currently playing on their respective tours. And if you don't have those relationships, it can be awfully difficult to make a case to be captain. So that may be the case for Phil ultimately, but we'll see what happens and what the future holds.